Good evening. My name is Mick Napier from the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and we're very pleased in the second talk in this series of authors involved in the shortlisted and involved in the Palestine Book Awards to have Paul Kelemen. Paul is the author of The British Left and Zionism, History of a Divorce, published by Manchester University Press in 2012. He's also extremely active in the Sheffield branch of Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the Sheffield branch itself being a very active part of that campaign. So tonight, Paul is going to speak to the topic of his book, i.e. take a long view of the relationship, but he'll conclude his remarks by reference to the current witch hunt, the current series of false accusations of anti-Semitism, politically driven accusations inside and outside the Labour Party. It's obviously major inside the Labour Party, but it's also a burning issue up here in Scotland, where we've seen years of SPSC activists on trial for facing false accusations of racism for activities purely arising out of BDS activities. Without further ado, I'll introduce Paul. He comes highly recommended by the other comrades in the Sheffield PSC branch, but having looked at his book, I think it's really an essential part of the education of people who want to campaign actively in Britain in support of the Palestinian people. Paul will speak for about 45 minutes. We'll give him longer if he needs it. And then there'll be time for a couple of questions, and then I'll make some concluding what can I say, a few notices about coming events. So, Paul, it's really great to have you here, speaking from Sheffield. The floor is yours. Paul Kelemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. The historic relationship between Britain and the Zionist movement is generally considered from the angle of the British state and its support for the Zionist project, which of course began with the Balfour Declaration. And I don't want to minimize that relationship in any way, but it's necessary also to take into account the historic role of the Labour Party in reinforcing that support. And in fact, in many ways, it is the Labour Party who has been responsible for popularizing the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, and for the subsequent conduct of the Israeli state, principally through its trade unions and the kibbutzim movement, that the idea of Zionism being a social democratic experience that was propagated principally through the Labour Party. And it is that which gained a fair degree of popular support. Of course, the elite support was always there. And in fact, in 1970, a Foreign Office memo points out that there would be much to be gained, it says, by a thoroughgoing pro-Arab policy, obviously from British imperialism's wider interest. But then the civil servant's note goes on to say, but a pro-Arab policy would be hard or impossible to adopt. A, because of British public and political commitment to Israel as an ideal and political force of the support for Israel in the country. And B, because of the pressure from the United States government. So we have these two factors, the popular support and the Israeli pressure, and these two forces continue to have played a role. And the Labour Party, I would argue, had the significant role in that popular support, in winning that support. And of course, when it has been in government, it has also had a role in aligning British policy with the American support for Zionism. Now, the beginning of that Labour Party support came even before the Balfour Declaration, that is to say, in August, 2.5 months before the Balfour Declaration, in the Labour Party's War Aims Memorandum, in which it set out the Labour Party policy for the post-First World War period, the Labour Party made a commitment to a Jewish home in Palestine in almost identical terms to what the Balfour Declaration was. In fact, in some respects, it is even more oblivious of the Arab presence in Palestine, because it doesn't even make that derisory and condescending reference to the so-called non-Jewish people whose rights, religious rights should be respected, not of course their political rights, but even that minimum degree of acknowledgement is not present in the War Aims Memorandum reference to the Palestine issue. And perhaps it is not surprising that that clause was included in the War Aims Memorandum. After all, there were two Labour members in the coalition government of Lloyd George, which considered the Zionist proposal for a Jewish home, which eventually turned into the Balfour Declaration. They were privy to those discussions. But what is more surprising, perhaps, is that there was no objection to it, either at the conference of the British Labour Party to approve that War Aims Memorandum, or subsequently that memorandum went on to become the socialist, the conference of Allied Socialist Parties, basically the conference of the Second International Socialist Parties. At that meeting the following year in 1918, that War Aims Memorandum with that clause on Palestine for supporting a Jewish home was endorsed. And again, there was no opposition to it. So we have to ask the question, why is it that the Labour Party and social democracy more generally, we tend to think about the social democratic parties on the continent as somehow more Marxist, somehow more radical than the British. But in fact, they shared many of the same assumptions. And principally, there was this very deeply entrenched view that European civilization, in all its forms, including in its labor movement, was a superior force, a superior stage of development to what was present in the so-called colonial world. And it was widely believed that the settlement of a Jewish population, consisting mainly of Jewish workers, would bring a more advanced civilization to this backward, stagnant Oriental world. And the social democratic movement shared all these cliches about the Middle East, which of course the elite propagated. There were, of course, other ideological strands which you can identify, one of them being that from the 1880s onwards, large numbers of Jews were moving to Western Europe, including Britain, and there was alarm, first and foremost among the ruling class, that the immigrant presence was a potential destabilizing force. There were also all these rumors about Jews being prone to Bolshevism, etc. So in fact, Lloyd George was the architect of the, Lord Balfour was of course the architect of the Aliens Act, which was devised to keep Jews out of Britain. And it was an open secret that Balfour had a very negative view of Jews as a clannish people who stuck together. He made these statements. It's ironic that Balfour, of course, is now celebrated in Israel and has streets named after him. And if there was a clear case of anti-Semitism, you couldn't find a better one than in the case of Lord Balfour. So there was this feeling that Jews were undesirable, and this was shared by sections of the working class movement's leadership, who feared that the Jews would undercut the wages of British workers would add to the housing problems, etc. But there were other strands too, apart from this fear of anti-Semitism, and one of it, I would say, it comes from a liberal imperialism. Now, in our those of us who come from a Marxist background, we tend to think of J. Hobson in a very positive light, and that's largely because Lenin, in his book on imperialism, was very complimentary about Hobson, for a perfectly understandable reason, because Hobson emphasized the decadent part of imperialism, as opposed to Kautsky, who believed that imperialism still represented a kind of progressive stage in the development of capitalism. And so Lenin took and welcomed these aspects of Hobson's contribution in his book, in Hobson's book called Imperialism, a Study, which was published in 1907. But that tends to ignore another dimension in Hobson's work, which was that he actually supported what he called sane imperialism. And by sane imperialism, he understood the idea that European population, with its more advanced civilization, should settle in another part of the world and develop it in a way that the indigenous people were held not to be able to develop it. And there is a kind of backdrop of social Darwinism to his thinking. The idea that there are more vigorous, more capable groups, and these inevitably triumph. So although Hobson, of course, knew very well and mentions the fact that in a number of places, colonizers have wiped out the indigenous people, he nonetheless thinks that is perhaps a necessary price that historical progress has to pay. So, ironically enough, although today we think of, rightly, of settler colonialism as being a particularly aggressive form of colonialism, because it has this logic of elimination, and that elimination can take a variety of forms, with genocide or subordination, separate development, all the different aspects that different forms of settler colonialisms have taken in the light of the balance of forces in the place and particular social configurations that existed there. Nonetheless, although we take it as a particularly aggressive form, actually in this period, settler colonialism was seen as preferable to the colonialism where the indigenous labor is exploited. These liberal imperialists, influenced by Hobson's idea, Hobson himself joined the Labour Party at the end of the First World War, and he was joined by a number of other people, most notably a person called Charles Buxton, and also people like Charles Trevelyan, Josiah Wedgwood. And they were the people who formulated the Labour Party's foreign and colonial policy. The Labour Party, until the end of the First World War, didn't really give any systematic thought to what the Labour Party's overseas policy should be. It was these people who defected from liberalism, mostly from the elite or from the middle classes, who then began to formulate a policy. Through the Labour Party's Imperial Committee, which was an advisory committee to the National Executive Committee. The idea that Hobson had propagated finds its reflection here in the Labour Party's Advisory Committee, and particularly in the sympathetic way in which they respond to the propaganda of the Labour Zionist movement. Now, in that period, the Labour Zionist movement in the UK had the presence through a political party called Pola Zion. And Pola Zion regularly provided memorandums and lobbied the Labour Party leadership. They organized a trip, for example, to the Labour Party leader in the 1920s, James Ramsay MacDonald, who of course became in 1929 the first Labour Prime Minister. And MacDonald wrote on the basis of his visit to Palestine a very laudatory and Orientalist stroke racist account of the figure of the Zionist in this sleepy corner of the Orient. He barely mentions the Arab presence, and only to make this contrast between the modernity represented by the Jewish settlers and the backwardness of this Orientals. So Polat Zion was a main lobbying organization, and there was a sort of division of labor in Britain and elsewhere on the continent, that the mainstream of the Zionist movement, headed by Chaim Weizmann, the general Zionist, who really wanted to form the new Jewish state on the model of liberal democracies, that he and his organization would be approaching mainly the ruling class, the political elite, the government, which was either liberal or Tory, and appeal to them on the basis, and they did appeal quite spontaneously because they believed that to be the case, that the new Jewish state could be a useful presence in the Middle East for the British Empire. So their argument was based on a pro-imperialist basis. We can be of service to the British Empire. But at the same time, and Chaim Weizmann set aside funds to help the activities of Polat Zion to lobby the labor movement. And they did that very vigorously, partly, as I say, by constantly passing on information to the Labour Advisory Committee on Imperial Questions, which advised the National Executive Committee. In fact, by the late 20s, it was routine for the Labour Party Advisory Committee on Imperial Questions, indeed for the Labour Party's General Secretary, to send Labour Party references and proposals and discussions on the Middle East, to routinely send them to leaders of Polat Zion for their approval, or at least for their advice, which was generally heeded. I have found innumerable occasions in the archives when Polat Zion representatives were given access and indeed invited to Labour Party meetings, and yet there was only one single occasion in which contact was made with a Palestinian workers' organization, only one occasion. And even that was treated in a very dismissive and condescending way. So the Labour Zionist movement had both access and ideological appeal to the Labour Party. And what I want to do is really give a series of snapshots by moving from period to period, just to give you, give some ideas about how the Zionist movement interlocked with the Labour Party and transmitted its message and its influence. So, as I said, initially, the attraction of the Zionist, Labour Zionist message, and the Labour Zionist message differed from the general Zionist message in the sense that they were saying, we are going to build a social society. Our aim is to bring workers into Palestine, to reconnect them with the land, to form agricultural cooperatives, the famous kibbutzim, which actually never involved more than 5% of the settler population, and to form Jewish trade unions. Now, people who went to university in the 1960s, 70s, and even early 80s will remember that it was quite popular, even for some left-wing students, to go to Israel and join the kibbutz, and sometimes they would come back and say, oh, how radical these people were, never mentioning the fact that right from the beginning, they were excluding and deliberately set up for that purpose, the kibbutz, to exclude Arab labor. That was their function. Of course, there were also cohesive settlements for military purposes and were strategically placed. But nonetheless, it was ethnically based. It wasn't class-based, so it had very little to do really with socialism. And similarly with the trade unions, I mean, they were, the Histadrut was a sectarian organization. It fought against Jewish entrepreneurs moving into Palestine to support the settlement activity from employing Arab labor, which was often very tempting for Jewish capitalists, whether in the agricultural sector or in the industrial sector, because they were cheaper. So, of course, they had their homes, could partially subsidize their living from the land, and they were generally, certainly as agricultural activity goes, more efficient and more skilled. It appealed nevertheless to the labor movement to have what appeared to be another socialist movement say that we're going to develop these socialist embryos of a future state with these Jewish workers. And an added attraction, if you like, was the fact that they said that we are constructivists. We are not like the Bolsheviks. And of course, there was a very strong strand of anti-communism in the Labour Party. We are going to build these oases of agricultural cooperatives and these trade unions gradually, pacifically, not by smashing the state. And of course, that again had another appeal because the Zionist labor movement, in inverted commas, wasn't a threat to the British Empire. Instead, they were saying, no, we want to collaborate and work within the British Empire. And of course, the colonial project of Zionist movement could not be realized without the protection of the British state. And in fact, because of the successful lobbying, the Zionist settlers in Palestine secured from the British state privileges which no other settler population secured in other parts of the empire. So, for example, it's only in the case of Palestine that the British were prepared to allow a protected market for certain manufactured goods, which of course meant that British imports, British manufacturers trying to sell material in Palestine were in an unfavorable position, whereas everywhere else, including, of course, most spectacularly in India, the British did the very opposite. They wanted to favor their own manufacturers back at home. And of course, in the case of India, they also made some concessions eventually. But in other places like Kenya, they did not. So again, it's evidence of the way that the Zionist movement was dependent, both for militarily and economically, on British support. But ironically, at this stage, of course, the Labour Party was not for dismantling the British Empire. And only in the 50s did it very reluctantly come around to that view that the empire would have to be abandoned. But certainly prior to that, prior to the Second World War, that idea was almost completely absent from the Labour Party ranks. And so the idea that the Zionist settlement activity could take place within the framework of the British Empire was something that they welcomed. generally, the Labour Party viewed the Zionist movement's activities in a favourable light, and people like Herbert Morrison, who was ferociously anti-communist, believed that it was a model in some ways that could be countered against the Bolshevik model, which even in the 1920s had considerable attraction in the ranks of the Labour Party, particularly on its left wing. Even when it was beginning to ossify into its Stalinist mold, it still had a considerable sympathy that here was a project that perhaps had a lot of merits. So people like Herbert Morrison explicitly promoted the Zionist, Labour Zionist project as a positive counter, as a positive variant of socialism. And he himself, Herbert Morrison, became deputy leader of the Labour Party. I think, from memory, in 1934, was a very strong advocate of Zionist settlement activity. Now, by contrast, I want to move on to say something about the Communist Party and the Communist movement in the UK, which was, of course, relatively small, but nonetheless, I mean, in the 1930s, it had about 2,500 members, and the Daily Worker had a circulation roughly of about 7,500. But its influence was much greater than that, because it had supporters among intellectuals who didn't declare themselves directly to be communist. And it also had an influence on the left wing of the Labour Party, particularly among trade union activists. And that influence grew of course, during the war. But let me say that the communist movement was different from the Social Democrats in the sense that they were critical of the Zionist movement. Now, initially, that criticism, of course, was articulated by Lenin and by Trotsky. And so the Communist Party, to some extent, held to that orthodoxy. And Lenin's preoccupation was fundamentally in relation to the impact of Zionism on the Russian communist movement, on the Russian workers' movement. That he held Zionism to be divisive because it wanted it wasn't interested in what was happening in Russia. It wanted to take workers elsewhere to fight another battle. So Lenin's preoccupation was its impact on the Russian working class movement, not on its impact on Palestine. And it's only in 1929 when the first, perhaps there were some violent clashes in 1920 and 21 in Palestine, but there were really serious clashes in 1929. And it's only then that the communist movement really begins to address the issue of what impact Zionism has on Palestine and on Palestine's Arab population. And they then begin to point to the Histadrut, the General Federation of Jewish Labor, the trade union movement, to its sectarian practices and to the way that they are excluding Arab workers, except in the public sector, of course, where the British were in control from 1922 onwards, and the British didn't allow the exclusion of Arab workers, obviously, because that would have jeopardized their presence at a time when the Arab population of Palestine were the vast majority. So in the public sector, where the Zionists organized a union, they would organize a subordinate union for the that would be open to Arabs, but it was always a subordinate branch and always one whose interest was subordinated to the Jewish interests. You can read that in Zachary Lockman's book called, I think think it's called Comrades and Enemies or something like that. The Communist Party therefore was critical of the sectarian practices, and I think the contrast between the Labour Party's and the Communist Party's position comes out in the 1936 uprising in Palestine, which was initiated by Arab workers, by Palestinian workers, and it was directed against British imperialism because they saw the country gradually being turned over to the Zionist movement by the increasing pace of immigration, which of course accelerated after 1933. And it has to be said that in the period 1927 and 29, it looked as if the Zionist movement would not be able to attract enough Jewish workers to come to Palestine. Many more wanted to go to the United States. And in the years 27 to 29, more Jews left Palestine than came into Palestine. But of course, from January 1933 onwards, with the accession of Hitler to power, the situation changed, and with the liberal democracies restricting and in some cases blocking entry of Jews into their own countries, Jews began to look to Palestine as a refuge. And in that situation, the Zionist movement was able to increase its numbers. So because of that alarm, there was an uprising, a very serious one. For 6 months, there was a general strike. And then that strike spread to the countryside. Of course, the Zionist movement at that stage showed its hand, because up till then, it had always argued that its presence would be to the benefit of the Palestinian workers as well. They would bring more modern techniques, they would provide a market for the Arab peasantry, etc. But when the strike came, they colluded with the British to try and undermine the strike in every way they could, but principally, of course, by breaking the strike and carrying on the work that previously the Palestinians had done, including, of course, and principally in the public sector, which the British controlled, which was responsible for the infrastructure, for the railways and the ports. So they were strike breaking. Now, in this situation, the Communist Party was extremely critical of the British, which of course included house demolitions, mass arrests, over 1,000 people executed. All of these repressive methods were condemned by the Communist Party, and the Communist Party also pointed to the Zionist movement's efforts to undermine the strike. But nonetheless, even at that stage, the Communist Party was calling for working class unity. And that kind of is reminiscent of the way that, for example, the militant in the 1970s and 80s were calling for Israeli and Palestinian workers to unite because they had a common interest against capital, ignoring the national dimension of the question. I'll come back to that perhaps later on, but the point is that the Labour Party depicted the strike as reactionary, and one stage was saying that don't believe that this is like our general strike in 1926, which of course the Labour Party also didn't support. But they were saying this is violent, and they were completely condemnatory, whereas the Communist Party, as I say, were generally supportive of it, but did not take into account the settler colonial nature of the Zionist movement, which meant that the Jewish workers were a privileged stratum. I mean, if ever the term labor aristocracy be used, which of course was formulated by Lenin in relation to the collaboration of the working class movements in the First World War on the side of their respective bourgeois states. If ever there was a case or a labor aristocracy, then the Jewish working class, which was subsidized by the Zionist movement, and which had this privileged position of having areas of the economy which was prioritized for them and earmarked for them, then this surely was. But the Communist Party very much worked on this kind of very vulgar economistic basis that anybody who was a worker would therefore have an interest in opposing capitalism. But of course, that was not the case of the Zionist movement, notwithstanding the fact that there was a sizable Jewish working class population which had come in as immigrants. They were workers, but their interest was aligned with British imperialism because it needed the British imperial state's protection, and they were aligned with Jewish capitalists who were coming into Palestine, investing their capital there because they depended on their future investment to grow the nation state. So this was a working class which was integrated into the apparatus of colonization, of nation building, supported by capitalists and by British imperialism. Now, I mention the Communist Party's position because until the 1930s and even into the war, although they begin to tone down from 1942 onwards with the Hitler occupies the Soviet Union in 1941, and then in 1942 the situation crystallizes that there's going to be a war, that the Soviet Union has to have support of the West to save itself. I mean, there has to be some kind of alliance that consolidates, and the Soviet Union at that stage encourages its communist parties to rally in support of the anti-Nazi struggle and to tone down its criticism of British imperialism, which is now an ally of the Soviet Union. So notwithstanding that toning down of criticism of British imperialism and therefore what the British are doing in Palestine, it still articulates some criticisms of the Zionist movement. But that changes dramatically after the war. And I want to come to that in a minute, but just to signal to you that when in 1947 the Soviet Union changes its position, and suddenly, or a matter of a few months at most, it declares its support for a Jewish state in Palestine. It puts its support behind Zionism. That silences in Britain and in other parts of Europe too the last and the most effective, I would say most effective, if not necessarily the last, because there were some other people, individuals who continued to criticize Zionism, but nevertheless the last effective political opposition to Zionism who were taking a pro-Arab perspective was silenced as a result of that. So when the Nakba comes in 1948, this dramatic ethnic cleansing and the destruction of Palestinian society, then that voice is silent. There is no anti-colonial voice pointing out what had happened, what the situation of the Palestinians were in any systematic, progressive way. And the I would say that the progressive voice in 1948 in response to the destruction of Palestine is more or less absent. And it's not only until 1967 really that the left, the radical left, the new left principally, wakes up to the reality of what had happened in 48 in the light of what happens in 1967 when, of course, Israel occupies the remaining 22% of Palestine that it didn't occupy in 1948. So the only opposition, ironically, which is voiced in Britain in the wake of the 48 Nakba, comes from the British government itself, from Ernest Bevin, who was actually on the right of the Labour Party, was Foreign Secretary in the Labour government after the war, and he articulates criticism of the expulsion of the Palestinians, even against his own backbenchers, from where there's vigorous support for the establishment of Israel and pushing for the recognition of Israel by the British government as quickly as possible. Bevin points out that these 500,000 people, it was actually more than that, but nonetheless he refers to the number of 500,000 people. He says they didn't leave voluntarily. And he tries to push back on this strong support for the newly established Jewish state and for ignoring the fate of the Palestinians, coming from the ranks of the labor movement. Because, of course, he's afraid of the repercussions in the wider Arab world. And there were reports from the refugee camps and even from their own ambassadors and consular staff in Transjordan and in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, that the Arab population widely blames Britain for what had happened to the Palestinians. And one of the embassy staff say, hatred for us is unbelievable. This is embassy staff who visits some of the refugee camps, and he's shocked. He says, shocked by their condition and shocked by the venom, which of course people are experiencing because of the terrible fate that has befallen them. Now, in this situation, what can Labour Party advocates of Zionism say when they had said that Zionism was to the benefit of Arabs? I mean, take somebody like Richard Crossman, who was on the left of the Labour Party. He was part of a group called Keep Left, which was campaigning to keep the Labour government true to its socialist principles. I mean, Crossman could never face up to what had happened to the Palestinians. He began to denigrate the Palestinians as people who were lived in dirt, and what did it matter that they had been expelled because what they lived in were mud huts anyway. Completely racist comments, and unable to grasp the dimension of the disaster that had befallen the Palestinians. So basically, from 48 onwards till 1967, the Labour Party was pro-Israel. It ignored the Palestinians and the wider Arab nationalist movement, often from an anti-communist position, but really also from a point of view of defending British imperial interest. This was even the case with somebody like Aneurin Bevan. I mean, Aneurin Bevan, who was such a strong advocate of nationalization of British industries, was totally opposed to Nasser nationalizing the Suez Canal. So when it came to an imperial issue, a person like Aneurin Bevan on the left of the Labour Party was nonetheless a thoroughgoing imperialist. And Bevan himself was very pro-Israel. So the strongest support for Zionists, for Israel and for the Zionist movement came from the left of the Labour Party. On the right of the Labour Party, admittedly a very thin strand, carried on in the Bevin tradition of thinking that there should be a more balanced position vis-a-vis the Middle East, slightly more balanced between the pro-Arab, slightly more between Arab states and Israel. There should be a slightly more balanced view because of the long-term interest of British imperialism. Of course, there was if you like, a more middle ground, which, because of its pro-Americanism, was generally supportive of Israel wholesale. But as I say, it was in a kind of general and fairly passive way, but it was the left wing which was the most vigorous advocate of not only supporting Israel, but of seeing Israel as a beacon of social democracy in the Middle East. And in some senses, and this is what Crossman believed, it was a model for the middle way. I mean, this third way, which Blair was one of the late advocates, is something that is present in social democracy right through from 45 onwards. The Keep Left group, of which Richard Crossman and Michael Foot and other left-wingers are the stalwarts, they always believed that there was another way, not communism, which was too dictatorial and too repressive, not capitalism, which created these incredible inequalities and exploitation, but a middle way. And they thought that Israel provided that social democratic model with its welfare state, with its trade unions, with its cooperative. It was seen as a beacon of socialism. And of course, that took a blow in 1967 with Israel occupying the remaining 22%, as I said. And at that stage, the Israeli army confronting directly the Palestinian population, again carrying out ethnic cleansing, again committing endless barbarities against the Palestinian population, and which began to filter through even bourgeois publications like the Sunday Times. But really, I would say that it was not until 1973, again after another Arab-Israeli war, when the occupation is consolidated and Israel's conduct becomes ever more brutal and arrogant, that some elements in the Labour Party began to express misgivings. So this is a case, for example, with Eric Heffer, one of the members of the Keep Left, a Liverpool MP who is known to be on the left of the Labour Party, who was a strong supporter of Israel, but in '73 he says he resigns from what by then had become Labour Friends of Israel. So what initially Paul Etzion was affiliated to the Labour Party, but in '67 it transforms itself into, it doesn't disband itself, but it forms another organization, if you like, a front organization called Labour Friends of Israel. And Labour Friends of Israel has quite a lot of left-wing members like Eric Silverman and Eric Heffer. At that stage, Heffer resigns openly. Tony Benn also shuffles away from gradually without ever announcing a clear break with them. So 73 is a major point, but I would say an even more significant point is 1982, the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which of course the Israelis are responsible for, because although the actual murder was carried out by their allies, by the Christian Phalange, because from 79 onwards, Israel intervenes in Lebanon. It gradually goes right up to Beirut, besieges Beirut, bombs Beirut in order to force the PLO to withdraw from there. In that process, using the Phalange as their advanced guard, if you like. The Phalange enter the Sabra and Shatila camp and massacre over 1,000 Palestinians. And of course, the Israelis bomb Beirut, causing over 20,000 deaths. And that happens to coincide with a Labour Party conference. And at that conference, there is considerable opposition articulated against Israel. And in some senses, throughout the 80s, with there's a more radical left that develops within the Labour Party associated with people like Ken Livingstone, there is a significant opposition to Zionism and to Israeli occupation and policies, but not that is not reflected adequately on the Parliamentary Labour Party, where the MPs are still overwhelmingly supportive of Israel, including, of course, the leaders such as Harold Wilson and Callaghan. Now, just to fast forward a little bit, throughout the period of Wilson and Callaghan, they are supportive of basically the Israeli Labour Party position, which is that a solution should be, in inverted commas, should be found to the Palestinian issue, but the Palestinian grievance, as they see it, as via the Jordan solution, i.e. the West Bank should be federated to Jordan, but they are vehemently opposed to the Palestine Liberation Organization being the representative of, the Palestine Liberation Organization being the sole representative of the Palestinian people. And in that sense, Callaghan and Wilson, in fact, principally Callaghan, lags behind even the way that the European leaders, West European leaders, are moving, because they've increasingly moved to the position that yes, the PLO has to be part of a negotiated solution. So they even lag behind that. But in 1994, when Blair becomes leader of the new, becomes leader of the Labour Party, and the new Labour project takes hold, part of the lesson that the new Labour advocates, principally Blair and Brown and their advisors, draw is that the Labour Party must move to the right to rectify the 3 defeats that the Labour Party had suffered in general elections. And that move to the right has to be take the form of demonstrating that the Labour Party is committed to the pro-American orientation of the British state, and that the Labour Party has to repair its relationship with the City of London to show that it's willing to continue British capitalism more or less on the lines that it has followed since the war. For those reasons, and I think the electoral consideration is of winning back Jewish votes is a relatively minor one, because you have to remember that the Jewish population reaches its peak after the war of around 400,000, but by the partly because of outmarriage, partly because of low birth rate, the Jewish community is only about 250,000. So, and it's only in a few constituencies, and even there, it's not entirely demonstrated that there is such thing as a Jewish vote, i.e. that you can count on Jewish people voting one way because of the belief that a particular party will is particularly friendly to Israel. So that's not demonstrated, but it may, in certain constituencies, be a marginal factor. But the principal reasons, I think, in the New Labour project of demonstrating that the Labour Party is committed to Israel was, as I say, by its desire to demonstrate a pro-American orientation, and by the belief that to relink with the City of London, financial interests and the large industrialists, Jewish industrialists, Jewish capitalists can play a useful mediating role, because to some extent Jewish capitalists were never completely integrated into the British elite, and were sometimes more open to mixing with Labour Party politicians. This was the case certainly under Wilson. So Michael Levy, for example, played this role for Blair. So one of the boasts that Blair made was that Labour Friends of Israel has been rebuilt under New Labour. After 1 year in office under him, incidentally, his own office was funded by a number of Jewish entrepreneurs. His shadow office, I mean, while he was opposition leader. And one of his boasts was that a sign of the Labour Party being reinvigorated was that Labour Friends of Israel was attracting more and more members, and that it had a bright future. So whereas by the end of the 80s, the Labour Friends of Israel was really in a very weak, very powerless position. It required funding from the Israeli embassy to survive. From 1994 onwards, it's clearly seen as an important organization at which Labour Party leaders make clear their support and their presence, and the membership of Labour Friends of Israel by Labour MPs is a guarantee, not a guarantee, but a precondition for political advancement. The realignment of the Labour Party comes from the top. The dissidence of the 80s is what is left behind during the Blair years. Now, perhaps I should just say a few words at this stage about the Jewish community, because undoubtedly in the 1920s and 1930s, the Zionist movement struggled to get the support of the Jewish community in Britain and elsewhere to support the Zionist project. And it's really only when it's seen that the liberal democracies will not allow Jews into to their own countries that Zionism gains traction in the Jewish community. And then after the war, with Jews becoming becoming increasingly middle class, and that is most dramatically illustrated by the developments of the East End of London, where the Jewish population moves, the East End as a Jewish community breaks up, and most of the Jews move towards the North London. And that's a kind of indication of a very important transformation of what was a predominantly working class community prior to the war becomes an increasingly petty bourgeois community, which comes under the dominance of the wealthier Jews who promote Zionism, sometimes consciously as a counterdote, as antidote to socialist and communist ideas, sometimes simply as a way of integrating the community behind them. And the principal way where this happens is through philanthropic mobilization for collection. Initially, philanthropic activity in the Jewish community was for supporting the refugees in the 1930s, but gradually this is diverted to saying that we need to support the refugees when they arrive in Palestine, and then that is transferred to supporting Israel, who's supporting the refugees who'd gone there. So from supporting refugees, it becomes actually supporting the state through organizations like the Jewish National Fund UK, which supports the purchase of Arab land and putting it in the hands of Zionist organizations, basically a program of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, which goes on to this day. Now, the Zionization of the Jewish community takes place, as I say, through this philanthropic mobilization, endless fundraising activities, but also increasingly from the late 50s onwards through the establishment of Jewish schools, initially primary schools and then secondary schools. And that is converges quite neatly with support by governments to faith schools. They take advantage of the funding that's available under that label to establish Jewish schools. Now, interestingly, initially there was quite a lot of tension between the Zionists and the Jewish religious establishment, because the Jewish religious establishment saw the Zionist leadership as essentially secular and taking away Jews from their religious commitments. But increasingly, as the Jewish population, along with the rest of the British population, becomes more secular, they want to increase the Jewish education of the youth, and they see schools as a useful way of doing that. The Zionists, on the other hand, and incidentally, the out marriage is something that seriously concerns the Jewish community, Jewish religious leaders. And the Zionist leaders, on the other hand, see schools as a way of propagating their Zionist message. And so they get together, the two constituents, two organizations get together to establish Jewish schools, the religious hierarchy and the Zionists from political motivation point of view. And the Jewish middle class responds to this, because by the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, in the inner cities, the Jewish middle class shares a general panic of sections of the white middle class that the inner city schools are going to the dogs, as they say, because of principally for the immigrant population. That's a kind of racist view, racist optic through which they see the developments, and the establishment of Jewish schools is seen as a way of providing this white enclave or Jewish enclave, if you like. And this provides a way of indoctrinating the youth in Zionism. Teachers are brought over from Israel on the basis that they need to teach Hebrew, and there are Jewish weeks organized, or Israeli weeks are organized at which information about Israel and Zionism is put over to the kids. So the shift to Zionism in the Jewish population is really the product of this intense program of indoctrination. And interestingly, it also happens in the United States, but recent times, it's in the United States that there has been a breakaway from that on a much more significant dimension than has been the case in Britain. But nonetheless, it is also happening in Britain that a lot of young people just switch off, even if they don't openly commit themselves to an anti-Zionist position. Now I'm realizing I'm running out of time, so I want to shift on to the period of the, very briefly, just say something about the Blair years. I mean, Blair was as one of part of his endless triangulations, once he came to power in 1997, always gave eloquent words about how seriously he took the situation of the Palestinians. But there was never anything more than an attempt to reconcile the Palestinian demands for self-determination to try and accommodate it within Israel's demands. And of course, those demands were formulated in security terms, that Israel's security must be paramount. And it was Israel who was allowed to define all the time what those security concerns were. Needless to say, nothing happened during the Blair period to halt the relentless settlement expansion and the entrenchment of the occupation.
Paul, could you bring your remarks to a conclusion?
I will do. So I think to come to the current situation, I think when Corbyn got elected, the years of impunity for Israel's continuing settlement expansion and colonization was perceived to be under threat. And therefore, a much more aggressive campaign was adopted towards the left. It has always been the basis of the Zionist movement that the radical left, by questioning the ethnic character of the Israeli state, was anti-Semitic. And now that campaign has been stepped up and generalized to the Labour Party as a whole. And that is related, I believe, to the fact that they can no longer justify, even in the terms of the liberal mainstream, that Israel is in any way committed to a peaceful settlement, call it a two-state solution or whatever. It is committed to a continuing process of colonization. And therefore, it's now necessary to go for the messenger rather than being able to deny the message, because it's quite clear that there's no intention to halt the gradual transfer of the West Bank into Zionist hands. And there's no question of any serious addressing of the Palestinian national rights. So the charge of anti-Semitism has to be seen in the wider context of all the different ways in which the PREVENT program has been used to try and stifle debate in schools, in universities, the way that local authorities have been tried to curtail their activities in terms of their policies on pension funds and contracts, so that they don't they're prevented from supporting the boycott campaign. In all this way, there is an attempt to close down the anti-Zionist movement, the pro-Palestinian movement. And I think to some extent, we have to look at that as a sign of our strength, the fact that a pro-Palestinian movement is now effective and is developing ever stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you very much for making yourself available to give that talk. We'll share that with the other talks in this program. If I could simply add one announcement now, it is that the next presentation will be the first Thursday in July by Professor Ella Shohat from New York University, who'll be talking about her book on being an Arab Jew. Professor Shohat is Jewish, born in Baghdad, and she identifies as an Arab Jew, and her criticism, her subversion of Zionism comes from and an angle that's not usually dealt with adequately in our political discussion. But once again, I'd like to thank Paul Kelemen for coming, and we'll use this recording, Paul, to the maximum to educate people about the really surprising element of collusion between the left of the Labour Party and even elements further to the left with the Zionist project. So once again, thanks very much, Paul.
Thank you very much.